From the Conga Latin Bistro on East Hennepin in Minneapolis, it's On Cue, the program that explores our urban environment. Phill Lindsay's guests include Ann Forsyth, talking about top items on the urban environment agenda, and Sarah Riddle, discussing her work with young people on environmental issues and actions. We'll also visit the 2003 Minneapolis Q Awards and see what urban environment issues are most on people's minds. All this and a bit more on Q, March 2003. Here's your host, Phill Lindsay.
Hello and welcome to On Cue, the show that talks about our urban environment, and we're here today at the Conga restaurant. We'll be back with our first guest, Ann Forsyth, right after we meet the owner of the Conga restaurant, Jovani Thunstrom.
I'm the owner of Conga Latin Bistro, located at 501 East Hennepin, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Conga is an authentic restaurant and club serving Nuevo Latino cuisine, which is a cuisine from Spain, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Dominican Republic, and South America. We have live bands. We have DJ playing the latest on tropical music. We have a full-service bar, a beautiful, elegant dining room, a large dance floor, and a stage for some of our presentations. So I hope you enjoy. And if you come to Conga, just ask for me.
And we're back. We want to thank Jovani. It's great to be here at the Conga, and I hope you folks take an opportunity to come here as well. My first guest, I'm actually very pleased to have here. She's been in town only less than a year. Ann Forsyth. It's nice to have you on the program.
Nice to be here.
And Ann is the director of the Design Center for American Urban Landscape. And for those folks who maybe don't know what the Design Center is, could you briefly describe it, maybe its mission, what you do?
The Design Center is a center that's been around for about 15 years, and it's interested in examining how design can make a difference in solving important urban problems. And it does that in 4 ways. We've been particularly interested in how to develop better suburbs and redevelop older suburbs to make them better. We're interested in using design to integrate systems at a metropolitan scale, and that's sort of complicated, but what it means is using design to integrate things like transportation and land use together. We are also interested in urban design as a more general area of inquiry. And finally, we've looked at key sites across the metropolitan area, things like arterial roads or suburban downtowns.
Fascinating. Now, I can't help but notice that from your accent, you may not be a native of the American urban landscape. Where do you come from?
Oh, I'm originally from Australia, although I've lived in the United States for 12 of the last 15 years.
And been quite productive, as I've learned about you. You've published one book, another is under review right now, and you've been involved with design firms, I believe, when you were in Massachusetts?
Yes, in Massachusetts, I didn't have a firm. I had a design center at the university, like the Design Center here.
Is that what you were doing before you came here?
Just before I came here, I'd actually worked at Harvard for 3 years, where I was mostly doing research and teaching.
Well, one of the topics I really wanted to explore with you a little bit is what are some of the priorities for our urban environment these days? This seems to be a time of great change in America, and as I think you've started to articulate, how our urban environment is designed, planned, and then developed is crucial. What's on the top of your list right now? What are you thinking about?
Oh, there are a million things on top of my list. But I suppose as I was thinking about this talk today, I thought of 2 particular issues, placemaking and the regional environment. Placemaking is very interesting. Most of the built environment of United States metropolitan areas has been built in the last 50 years. There was a big increase in the production of housing, for instance, around the middle of last century. So about 1 million units were produced each year for those 50 years at the end of the century. And what that means is that we have a lot of the environment that's fairly new, but some of it is sort of getting frayed around the edges. It's aging, it's 30, 40, 50 years old. Now, they're often great environments, but they need some care and attention. And the particular kind of care and attention I'm interested in is in making them really wonderful places to be, not just developments or houses or shopping centers, but really creating a sense of place.
Well, if I may, and as a layperson, I mean, isn't part of the rap against a lot of that stuff that was built post-World War II, you know, Levittown, tract homes, and anonymous suburbs? And the materials that tended to be used weren't quite the same quality that we maybe saw 50 years prior to that?
Yeah, there are actually a lot of problems. Of course, there's a lot of variation in those suburbs, and the one thing that's happened in that 50 years is that suburbs, and that includes the suburban parts of centre cities, have become much more diverse. They're not just residential areas anymore. There are jobs, there's multiple recreational opportunities, lots of shopping opportunities, and they're all mixed up together. So you can really live your life almost anywhere in the metropolitan
Well,
area.
and thankfully, even one of the things I most notice now is that some of the canopy, the tree cover is now getting mature, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, plants are very forgiving to suburban areas. But in fact, one of the interesting things is that landscape architects in particular have always been quite involved in designing suburban areas because of the sort of plant issue. But in any case, there is this issue about having to create good places out of these sort of aging developments. But that relates to a second issue to do with placemaking, which is this topic of globalization. And it seems like globalization is something that's sort of become very prominent in the 1990s. But in fact, it's working out a set of economic and technological changes that occurred in the 70s. I actually went back to graduate school in the 80s to understand globalization because I was practicing as a planner and I could feel the impacts of globalization and wanted to understand it. Now, in terms of urban design and globalization, cities and regions have two main kinds of approaches to this issue of globalization in terms of interacting with economic globalization. What economic globalization does is it allows businesses to be much more selective about where they are located. They can locate almost anywhere across the globe. For instance, if you call up and make a reservation for airlines, you could be talking to someone in a different country. Cities and regions have had two basic approaches to trying to attract those businesses who have a lot of choices about where they could be. One is cheapness and one is uniqueness. Now, cheapness is obvious. You try and have lower labor costs or inexpensive cost of living. Uniqueness is the strategy of places like Seattle or San Francisco or Boston. They have interesting either urban or natural environments that can attract very high-end workers and the firms that are associated with them. They're the places that become the high-tech centers and so on.
Might another factor sometimes be a highly educated or a well-educated population?
Well, the well-educated population will move to those unique and interesting
Okay,
places.
so the one follows the other rather than the other way?
Well, they interact with each other, but it's the strategy of a lot of locations to try and attract those populations.
Okay.
Now, the Twin Cities has actually done both. Until the late 90s, it was actually a very inexpensive place to live in a national sense. So it could compete, for instance, with Houston as a cheap place to be. But it also has a very vibrant cultural scene. Its built environment is very interesting. It's the landscape is quite dominant. It's not urban in the way central Boston is, but it's still an interesting environment that has some capacity to be unique.
If I may interrupt, you once said recently to me that to some extent what's built in our urban centers also it reflects a suburban mentality as well?
Well,
I'm not putting it the way you did, but...
No. Much of the Twin Cities is actually fairly low density in character, and that's what people actually like about it. It's why the parkways are such a prominent part of the metropolitan landscape and the way we think about the environment. The river is very important. It's the landscape structure that provides an overall framework for the Twin Cities. Anyway, the challenge for the Twin Cities in this sense, in terms of placemaking, is that the uniqueness strategy always seems very interesting. It means you have more artistic activity, you have interesting urban design and interesting architecture, interesting recreational opportunities, but it can lead to attracting a very high-end population and pricing other people out. A better strategy would be try to keep some of that low cost of living with those other benefits of a sense of place that has
Right.
uniqueness. Now, there are ways you can do this. It's actually quite tough to do that, but for instance, the city of Minneapolis's requirements for affordable housing and larger attached housing developments is one strategy for trying to keep the benefits of affordability even while the area is trying to become more unique in its sense of place.
Right, and not coincidentally to sort of raise its tax base by drawing in those high-end professionals and that sort of person.
Yes, and,
Right.
and certainly you want to have that population because it's a very creative
When
one.
I know you have a planning background, does this not make it more difficult when we have two sort of inner core cities and then a variety of suburban areas, all legislatively different, all managed differently? Because a net basis of affordable housing makes sense for the metropolitan area.
Right.
But how do we do that when you've got particular points of views and policymakers here and there spread all over?
It's very challenging, you know.
Yeah.
Many planners would love to be
Right.
the all-powerful person who tells people what to do. However, that's really not the American way. And I think one of the attractions about Minnesota to me was the fact that Minnesotans will often get together to try to do something that's good for the larger general public rather than just for themselves.
Now you've been here just long enough. Do you have that sense? Are we still living up to that reputation?
Oh, these are very challenging times. I came right in the middle of a set of challenging times, but I definitely feel that I've moved to Minnesota and that it has a unique character.
And we have just a moment left, but I wanted to ask, since you're doing all this good work at the university, and I know your projects take you out in the field a lot, and you have a dedicated crew of people, one of whom, Frank Fitzgerald, is your representative to the Q committee, I should mention, and he's made a great contribution. Are the various cities and suburban entities connecting with you and listening to you, and do you have a relationship you're building?
We've had relationships in the past and we'll have relationships in the future. One of the things that attracted me to the design center was that it was linked to a number of the cities and townships in the wider region. There are a number of ways that places can connect with us, and one of the interesting new opportunities people have is a thing called direct design assistance, where we will do small projects with citizen groups, cities, and non-profits, giving them some technical assistance about interesting projects. We have a very limited budget, so we can only do a few, but we're trying to give people opportunities to work with us. On the larger scale, we do a number of very big, long-running projects. For instance, we've done a large number of projects with the I-35W coalition north of St. Paul.
Very well. And I know in North Minneapolis, some of your folks have done some good work.
Yes, and we're actually doing several projects in the city of Minneapolis at the moment.
That's great. Well, I'm going to rattle off a phone number people can call. I think it's the general number for the Design Center for American Urban Landscape. That's 612-625-9000. Ann, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Nice to catch up with you. And we'll be back with our next guest, Sarah Riddle, to talk about eco-education. But first, let's listen to a few people who attended the recent Q Awards ceremony held in January at the University of Minnesota. And let's listen to a few of their ideas about what the urban environment priorities are on their minds. Stay tuned.
Quality of our air and water, because these are essential things to our lives, so we need those. We need them for our bodies. I think, you know, what we need for our spirits are the chances to be out in wild nature, and those are rare opportunities, of course, in the urban environment, and so we have to have those spots where we can connect to that feeling of what wild nature is all about. You know, we're not going to be able to preserve wide open spaces elsewhere in the world unless we know kind of what they are right here in our own little piece of town.
Open space. Right now, we're doing a lot of high-density housing. Brown Seven Corners is by way of example. And cars in that area have a more right to open space than the citizens that live in that space. I'd like to challenge the City Council and the Mayor and have them just look at 1 square yard for every resident in multiple housing, in dense housing. So if you had 50 people living in a unit, you'd have half a football field. That's all I'm asking. It's a very serious issue.
Affordable housing and transportation are two very pressing issues. First of all, affordable housing, just finding the low-income neighborhoods, incorporating those with open green space, and making them more livable and affordable for all types of diversity and ethnic groups. And also transportation, just the light rail systems and trolleys and mass transportation is quite important in the city.
Distribution of families of comparable, of different wealth categories. I see the city becoming more and more isolated by the income, which means by race almost. I like to see a more integrated city develop north and south.
Okay. And welcome back. Those were a few thoughts from folks at the Q Awards, some of their urban environment priorities. And speaking of priorities, I'm glad to have our next guest, Sarah Riddle.
Hello.
Nice to have you on the show.
Thank you.
And you are, I think I get this wrong before, you are the project coordinator?
Program coordinator.
Program coordinator with Eco Education, and they work with young people, I think, what, statewide, but primarily the Twin Cities?
Most of our programs are focused on the Minneapolis and St. Paul
The two inner cities.
But we do work outstate as well, and even some western Wisconsin.
Well, I'm so thrilled to know that a program like Eco Education exists. But for folks who've never heard of it before, what is it? What's your mission?
Well, what Eco Education is all about is really helping to foster within young people the awareness and skills to build ecologically sound decisions and actions. So what we do is we help young people, middle schools in particular, to look at environmental issues in their own communities, their own local urban communities,
right,
and build skills to address those through action projects.
See, that's the part that I was really keyed on, because decisions, how to think about the issues, what's the importance of these, but then there are actions to take. So that's a real engagement. Give me just a few random examples. What kind of actions do some of these middle school kids take on?
Well, sometimes they do education projects, and those things might be like a mural to describe solid waste issues in a grocery store parking lot. Trash maybe an issue there. Another one might be interpretive signs at a local wetland.
Oh, all right. So they would actually research and then produce these signs and go put them up.
Yes, they would. And we actually just recently had a big to-do about one of our local wetlands interpretive signs.
Now when you say a to-do, is that a good to-do or
it was a wonderful to-do.
Oh, good. All right.
It was a wonderful to-do. We also have students involved writing letter campaigns to local politicians and national politicians, working on, for example, supporting the current definitions in the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, there's a lot of change or slippage, let's say, in regards to that. Yeah.
Yes, and we have other projects that are more direct action, things such as restoring shorelines by planting projects.
And the young people get involved with that.
They do. They really enjoy getting involved with things.
So they get their nails dirty, they get right out there.
Oh yes, they definitely.
And as I already forgot, program coordinator?
Correct.
What does that mean for you? What do you do then?
I am actually, my job is to be supporting the teachers directly.
Okay.
So I'm actually in the classrooms helping to implement our programs, but also connect teachers to community partners that might be working on environmental issues in their communities.
Oh, all right. So you help teachers that might otherwise not have those connections to other resources. You help them make those connections.
Right. Help them network with it. And
how are you received? I mean, because in a way you're coming into kind of an existing educational arena, and for that matter, an existing community arena too. How is Eco Education in your program? How are they all being received?
Oh, I'd say very well. I'd say very well. We provide a lot of resources to the schools, professional development for the teachers, field trip funds, funds for mini grants for student action projects, all different sorts of resources.
Well, that would sweeten the pot a little bit, because these are trying times to find any funds to do anything creative or engaged or committed.
Right. It's a lot of fun, and we seem to have a lot of really good reactions to it.
You mentioned mostly middle schools. Is there a reason, not younger, not older?
Well, we have found that many of the environmental education programs happen in elementary school and in high school. And so we decided to go where there was more of a need, being middle school.
Interesting. Okay, so that's interesting. There's sort of a gap there. Wonder why that is.
I think partially it might be school structure and just kind of how things are set up. But we found we've been really successful in this.
Now, you guys have a very informative website. Maybe at the end of our talk, we'll get that web address up. But I noticed you have urban environment objectives. And there's quite a list of them, so I want to ask you to rattle them all off. But can you talk about some of them, some of those objectives?
Well, our program philosophy is based on something called the Tbilisi Declaration. And that really looks at comprehensive environmental education, looking at awareness, knowledge, values, skills, and participation. Really kind of the whole gamut of environmental education.
And when your organization uses the term urban environment, I can't help but think of the sort of the parent organization for this program that we're sitting here talking through, the Committee on Urban Environment. And by that, we tend to mean the built and the natural environment. When you folks are working with these young students, what do you mean by the urban environment?
I would say very similar to Q's definition.
Truly.
We do look at the built and the natural environment as well as the social environment. We look at how they all are interrelated, how humans interact with their environment, as well as the buildings and the infrastructures such as the sewage systems that are a part of our cities.
Well, I want to talk about some specific programs and projects that have happened and maybe some that are coming up, but this sounds like a fairly new service. How long has ecoeducation been around?
Ecoeducation has been around actually since 1991. We're
all right.
celebrating our 11th year.
Right.
Our programs have evolved a bit in the past few years, however, and the current programs as they are have been around for, 5 or 6 years now.
And what's your background? How does somebody go to college and say, this is what I want to do when I grow up? Or?
Well, actually my background as far as my bachelor's degree is in political science. However,
Well, that would work. I mean,
there's a lot of direct action and political activity that's happening around these issues as well. I also, when I was young, I went to an environmental learning center up in northern Minnesota and just fell in love with it and decided that's what I wanted to do.
wow, so that had a real effect on you?
It did.
Now, do you take some of that experience that you had and try and inculcate that in these 8th graders?
I definitely do, yes.
How are they connecting with what you're there to share, and obviously they're teachers as well? What's your assessment of how the young people are engaging in this education and the action?
The students get really excited because these are problems and issues that are happening in their own neighborhoods, either where they go to school or where they live.
Yeah.
So they get really excited about finding out, this is actually happening in my neighborhood, and they feel a lot of ownership over that. Our programs are also very youth-led. The students drive the whole process. They decide which issues they want to explore. They decide what project they want to pursue. They're the ones that are really in the driver's seat for our programs.
Well, that's great. I know that some of the ones in Minneapolis that you've been involved, some of the schools you've been involved with, the Interdistrict Downtown School. I know you've been working with some 8th graders over there. And again, from your website, I learned that you've done some work up in at Battle Creek School.
Battle Creek Middle School.
Middle School in North Minneapolis.
Actually, this one is in St. Paul.
Oh, that's the same. Oh, Battle Creek on the east side over there,
Yes.
maybe. Okay.
East side.
Isn't there a Battle Creek in Minneapolis? Well, you learn something every day. Okay. And Jefferson Middle School in Minneapolis. And they did an interesting bus tour,
Yes.
as I recall.
A number of our classes go on bus tours every year to explore neighborhood issues that are happening there. They get an up close and personal look at what actually happening. Sometimes it might be a contaminated site. Sometimes it might be a place where the light rail transit is going to be happening. There's all different things. The Reuse Center in Minneapolis is a location where students can see how goods are being reused and sold.
Right. And so they'll talk with, in that case, maybe the proprietor or the people that work there. Now, when they went out to look at, say, light rail transit, what exactly did they do? I mean, did they get in a little minivan and drive over and start looking at the site, or did they talk with people, or?
It's usually in a school bus, and
Yeah.
they get a chance to usually look at the site, and then we also want them to be able to talk to people that are working on those projects. For example, we have had a slideshow about light rail transit to kind of hear what all their plans are.
Interesting. Has there been anything with any of these students, I mean, anywhere that you've had programs, that really surprised you, that they came up with something that you would have never expected that they'd get really, engaged in or really steamed up about? I mean, did they ever see something that say, we've got to organize around this? Did anybody ever
Let's see.
just go off the third rail?
Well, one that I was surprised about this year is one of our classrooms at Interdistrict Downtown School is actually looking at indoor air quality, and specifically as it relates to environmental tobacco smoke.
Wow.
So they are taking on the issue of environmental tobacco smoke in indoor areas.
Wow, and was this something they defined? They kind of came up with this?
It was completely on their own.
Wow. Now I have to say, I mean, imagine like an 8th grader, I mean, it's not like they're going hanging out at bars and, you know, places like that. So wonder what stimulated that thought.
You know, I think what happened was they were doing a survey actually of community members on Nicollet Avenue, and they noticed how many people were smoking when they were doing this.
So they went out and talked to people.
They do. They
Real
go out and
basic
talk to
stuff.
people.
Fascinating. Well, we got a minute or two left. What are some of the projects that are sort of coming up on the horizon for eco-education?
We have so many different issues that students are working on this year. Some students are working with the ethanol plant, for example, in St. Paul. Some students are working with water pollution, and specifically as it relates to the Mississippi River. Some of the students are working on contaminated sites in their own neighborhoods. Some students are working on green space in downtown Minneapolis. It remains to be determined yet what they're going to actually do for a project.
They're just getting their arms around that issue, though.
Exactly. So we'll be seeing in the next.
So right downtown, right in the center of the core of the inner city Minneapolis. That's great.
Yes.
Well, Sarah, if people want to find out more about either some of these projects and programs, but eco-education, I know you've got a phone number.
651-222-7691.
So you're headquartered over in St. Paul, but you're really Twin Cities.
We are.
And there's also, as I said, this great website, and I know you know that address.
It is www.ecoeducation.org, and that is one word.
Eco-education. Although on your letterhead, it's actually 2 words.
Correct.
Right, but to get to the web page, it's one word altogether.
Correct.
Sarah, thank you very much. Nice to learn about eco-education. That was great. Now, we'll be back to wrap the show in just a moment, but let's go back to some of those Q Awards event attendees and get some more urban environment priorities from them. Stay tuned.
Keeping our neighborhood identity and our history as we move forward.
What we're doing with light rail and what it looks like, I don't know how much how many artists have been asked to help in the design of light rail. And also I'd like to see a little more public art and green spaces around too.
Identity in the communities. We need to have nodes for every community to identify with, whether they be community gardens, a space to ruminate, have performances locally within the communities, drawing people to them, having the identity brought forward, and bringing everyone in the community who moves in, whether it be new people or people who've been there for 15, 20 years, to have them actually identify with where they're living and take pride in their community and helping rebuild those communities from that sense. That I think is very pressing for us in an effort today to make Minneapolis a better place to live.
We need to keep our homes places where people feel safe and secure and optimistic about the future, and when they step out onto the street, they can see things like beautification along the streetscape that help make them feel better as people living in our grand city. And that's what we want out of our population. People who want to live here and feel proud about what they're doing and optimistic about the future.
And we're back. Some interesting ideas about priorities for the urban environment. Now, I do want to mention a couple of activities that Q sponsors coming up next month. Minneapolis Blooms Day, that kicks off the annual Minneapolis Q Blooming Boulevard Awards, and that'll be held April 26th at Logan Park for the first time in one location instead of throughout the city. The following month in May, in fact May 17th to be specific, Q will co-sponsor once again its long-held Arbor Day celebration, and that'll be at Pioneers and Soldier Cemetery, South Minneapolis. And if you want to find out more about those events, Q, the guests that were on the show, call Q. That's 612-673-3014. Well, we're done with the show, and it's time now to enjoy ourselves here at the Conga. Thanks for watching. I'm Phill Lindsay, and it's always good to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.